Millwood wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find yourself at the center of a national true crime headline. It was quiet, almost too quiet. A town of tree-lined streets, mom-and-pop diners, and front porches draped in wind chimes. The kind of place where people still wave to each other from across the street and kids walk to school alone. But beneath that postcard-perfect image, a darkness festered in the shadows, one that no one saw coming until it was too late. Dana Myers was a second-grade teacher at Millwood Elementary, beloved by students and parents alike. She was the kind of person who stayed late to clean up classroom projects and kept a box of granola bars in her desk for hungry kids. Everyone in town knew her, and everyone adored her, which is why her sudden disappearance sent a ripple of anxiety through the community. She hadn't shown up to work in 2 days. No one could reach her by phone. Her car sat untouched in the driveway of her quaint yellow house with white shutters. On the morning of October 14th, her best friend and co-worker, Emily Sanders, placed the call that would change everything, a request for a welfare check. Millwood PD responded around 9:30 a.m. Officers Mike Harrelson and Jenna Ruiz arrived at the scene and were immediately unsettled. Dana's mailbox was overflowing. Her porch light was still on, despite the morning sun, and the curtains drawn tight. But it was the smell, faint, metallic, lingering near the porch, that set off alarms. They knocked. No answer. Called out. Silence. Eventually, they forced the door open. What they found inside would unravel the soul of their small town. Dana was lying in her bedroom, her lifeless body posed grotesquely on the bed. Her hands were bound tightly with zip ties, her throat deeply slashed, and the words "Now you see me" were carved crudely into the wall above her head in what appeared to be her own blood. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. The killer had been calculated, clean, and terrifyingly methodical. Detective Andrew Lively, a seasoned investigator pulled from the state task force, described the scene as something you'd expect in a horror movie, not a teacher's home in a town like this. The media descended fast. National networks picked up the story, splashing Dana's smiling face across TV screens, framed by the headline, "Small-town slaying shocks the nation." Candlelight vigils were held, ribbons tied around trees. But behind the public mourning, investigators were under pressure to find answers, and fast. Initial interviews with friends and neighbors painted a portrait of Dana as universally loved. She had no enemies, no history of crime or mental health issues. She had recently broken up with her boyfriend, Brandon Kellerman, but friends said the split had been clean. Still, when detectives looked deeper, they uncovered troubling red flags. Brandon had a history of control. He frequently demanded to know Dana's whereabouts, snooped through her phone, and once followed her to a girls' night out, only to confront her in front of her friends. Dana had never filed a police report, hoping instead that ending the relationship would end the tension. Brandon had an alibi, sort of. He told police he was home watching movies on the night Dana went missing. No one could confirm it. He lived alone, had no pets, and when officers asked what he'd been watching, he smirked and said, "Something bloody." That was enough to elevate him to primary suspect, but they needed more. That's when they discovered the footage. Across the street from Dana's home, a newly installed security camera, part of a local neighbor's home surveillance upgrade, had caught grainy footage of a man entering Dana's house at 11:42 p.m. The figure wore a hoodie and dark jeans. At first, it was hard to make out a face, but forensic techs enhanced the footage. The gait, the height, the posture matched Brandon Kellerman perfectly. With video evidence in hand, detectives made their move. Brandon was arrested at his home without incident. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he was eerily calm. He asked if he should bring a toothbrush, claiming he knew this was coming. But what struck detectives the most was what came next. As Brandon was led into the police cruiser, reporters gathered outside caught a haunting image, Brandon turning to the cameras with a smile. Not a nervous smirk, not a grimace, a full, twisted grin. And just like that, he went from suspect to national obsession. What made him smile? In the days that followed, questions exploded across social media. Why did he smile? Was he proud, mocking, or simply incapable of feeling remorse? Brandon refused to speak with police during the initial interrogations. He sat silently, hands folded, occasionally humming to himself. His attorney requested a psychological evaluation, and what the doctors uncovered only made the case more chilling. 2 weeks after Brandon Kellerman's arrest, a team of court-appointed psychologists delivered their findings. The diagnosis: severe antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic traits, indicators often associated with psychopathy. But these weren't just textbook definitions. Brandon exhibited classic hallmarks: lack of empathy, superficial charm, grandiosity, and a chilling inability to feel guilt. But even among hardened professionals, Brandon stood out. Dr. Elaine Margot, the lead forensic psychologist, testified, "In 20 years of psychiatric evaluations, I've never met someone more capable of simulating emotion without actually possessing it. He knows what sadness looks like. He can imitate sorrow, but he does not feel it." His journal, discovered hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his apartment, was perhaps the most damning piece of evidence. Page after page was filled with fantasies of domination, rituals of murder, and grotesque sketches of women who looked eerily like Dana. The entries weren't dated but were numbered, 37 of them in total, each outlining hypothetical scenarios of stalking, capturing, and killing. Dana appeared in entry number 19. She resists control. She smiles too much. She needs to learn silence. Her voice is too loud in my head. He had been watching her, obsessively, planning, waiting, inside the interrogation room. After his psychological assessment, Brandon began to speak. At first, it was superficial. Small talk, sports scores, jokes. But eventually, he started talking about Dana. "I didn't hate her," he said, gazing at the table. "She just didn't understand me. Nobody does. I was supposed to be more than this. But she made me feel invisible." Detective Ruiz pressed him. "Why did you carve those words on the wall?" He smiled again. "Because now they see me." Despite the confession, Brandon showed no remorse. When asked if he regretted what he did, he tilted his head. "Not really. It was necessary." The prosecution knew this would be one of the most watched trials in the state's history. Brandon's smile, his remorseless confession, and the disturbing journal entries were all damning. But they also knew the defense would try to lean heavily on the insanity plea. They called in multiple experts to verify his mental state. Each concluded the same thing: Brandon was not insane. He was disturbed, dangerous, and detached, but he understood right from wrong. He was legally sane. Dana's family, especially her younger brother Mason, was determined to see Brandon face the full weight of the law. In a public statement, Mason said, "We want justice, not excuses. My sister's last moments were filled with terror. He should never see the light of day again." The now infamous mugshot of Brandon smiling, eyes vacant, lips curled upward, had gone viral. Social media dubbed him the smiling killer. Hashtags like #SmileOfEvil and #JusticeForDana trended for days. True crime communities dissected every detail, from his background to his high school essays, looking for clues. One post from a former classmate stood out. "He was always a little off. He'd laugh when people got hurt. Once, in sophomore year, he dissected a frog and whispered, 'Imagine if this were a person.' Everyone laughed it off. We thought it was dark humor. Now I wonder." Up next, the stage was set for trial. Prosecutors prepared their witnesses. Dana's parents steeled themselves for the nightmare of testifying. The courtroom would soon become the theater of Brandon's cold performance, and his smirk would return to haunt everyone who looked into his eyes. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in early March. Reporters lined the steps of the courthouse, cameras flashing as Brandon Kellerman exited the transport van in cuffs. And as if on cue, he did it again. He smiled. Inside the courtroom, the air was suffocating with tension. Dana's family sat in the front row, clutching tissues. Jurors, carefully selected for impartiality, couldn't help but steal glances at the defendant. Some later admitted that Brandon's demeanor unnerved them from the start. Prosecutor Linda Haynes began with a chilling summary of the evidence. She emphasized the premeditation, the brutality, and Brandon's disturbing journal. She looked jurors in the eyes and asked, "What kind of man writes a murder fantasy, acts it out, and then smiles about it?" The defense leaned heavily on mental illness. Brandon's attorney claimed he suffered from a profound detachment from reality and lacked the ability to understand the consequences of his actions. But Brandon's behavior throughout the trial told another story. He stared at the jurors, not with remorse, but with fascination. He doodled during testimony. When Dana's mother broke down on the stand, recalling the last phone call she ever had with her daughter, Brandon watched with a tilted head and an almost curious expression. At one point, a court officer reported that Brandon had carved a smiley face into the wooden bench of the defendant's box using a paperclip. It was removed immediately, but the damage was done. Jurors were rattled. The image of the smile, the symbol of Brandon's callousness, had been burned into their minds. The state called nearly 24 witnesses, detectives, forensic analysts, psychologists, Dana's co-workers, friends, and even Brandon's exes. The stories painted a terrifyingly consistent picture. Brandon was manipulative, obsessive, and emotionally vacant. Several women recounted eerily similar patterns: intense charm, followed by possessiveness, then cold detachment. One woman testified that Brandon once asked if she would still love him if he hurt someone bad. She thought it was a joke. The most damning moment came when prosecutors read entry number 23 from his journal aloud in court. "They'll remember me. Not her. They'll say my name. Not hers. She's the canvas. I'm the artist." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Dana's father stood up and left, unable to listen anymore. In a shocking move, the defense called Brandon to the stand. He was calm, composed, and oddly charismatic. He spoke in a soft, steady tone. When asked why he killed Dana, he paused, smiled, and said, "Because I could." No remorse. No hesitation. The courtroom froze. To be continued in part 4.